Earlier, I spoke to Julian Smith. She's the U.S. permanent representative to NATO. She told me what's in store for Ukraine following its initial membership application back in 2008.
In 2008, the alliance took the decision that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of the alliance. And now, as we move into this summit in Vilnius in just a few days' time, President Zelensky may very well come in person and ask the alliance for some sort of signal that the alliance is moving beyond that. The alliance is likely to come forward with a package of deliverables, both on enhancing our practical support for Ukraine and enhancing our political relationship with Ukraine. We will also, in the communique, talk about Ukraine's membership aspirations. But membership per se is really not on the table for this summit while a full-scale war is unfolding on their territory.
All right, and I take it the concerns are if there is a full-scale war, borders are uncertain, and of course at the heart of the NATO alliance is the commitment to mutual defense. And during a war, you do not even know where the borders are. You do not know when to defend what. But would it not be what Mr. Zelensky is asking for? He's saying once there is a ceasefire satisfactory to both Russia and Ukraine, could a more concrete promise be made then, be made now, that can be delivered then when a ceasefire happens?
Well, the question of membership in the alliance is actually a process, and it does require countries to undertake a series of reforms. Ukraine has made remarkable progress both on democratic and security sector reforms over many years, but there's some additional work to be done. And so we're not in a position to really put a timeline on the table. Our focus right now, first and foremost, is on getting the support that Ukraine needs to prevail and hopefully bringing about an end to this war. But the person who can truly bring about an end to this war is President Putin. Of course, he started it on February 24th last year and could end it today if he so desired. But we, as individual allies, will continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, as it defends its sovereignty and territorial integrity from Russian aggression.
But we do need to look beyond Mr. Putin at this point, because it's not just him. It's easy when we hear, for example, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Beijing or from Moscow itself, when the blame is put on NATO expansionism. But no less a figure than the current CIA director, William Burns, has said, and I shall quote him here, and this was when he was ambassador to Russia in 2008, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for Russian elite. And that's not just for Mr. Putin. I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. Now, this is an objective point of view from someone who really would know, because he's in place to know. Whether or not one feels Russia's position on expansionism is justified or correct, would this not be something to take into consideration when you think about admitting Ukraine or Georgia into NATO?
Well, we first and foremost believe that each sovereign nation has its own right to determine the alliances to which it wants to belong. And we do not believe that Russia can or should dictate the terms under which those decisions are made. But just to back up, I would want to stress to your viewers that NATO enlargement has nothing to do with the reason that Russia went into Ukraine. This is an unprovoked act of aggression, and Ukraine did nothing to deserve this war. It has a right to protect its territory under the UN Charter. It is protecting right now not only its own territory, but it is protecting the principles of the UN Charter, to which many countries around the world, most countries around the world, are a party. So I wouldn't want to confuse the war with NATO enlargement, and again stress that Ukraine has a right to determine its own alliances in the future, or those it wants to belong to.
as difficult as it may be to countenance at this point, would any concessions be made to Russia's concerns if you want to bring Russia to the negotiating table to talk ceasefire, and even more importantly, to ensure that this ceasefire, if ever it's reached, whenever it's reached, actually holds? Because we have 1994 Budapest Memorandum, that one fell apart because Russia didn't want to uphold it. So whatever ceasefire is reached, you have to ensure that Russia has vested interest in keeping to that ceasefire.
Well, a couple of things on that front. One, I would just make the point up front that it is not for the United States to determine the conditions under which negotiations will take place. We are going to leave that in the hands of President Zelensky. He needs to make that decision himself. Number two, I would say that the United States does welcome any country that wants to try and work towards peace here. Several countries have put ideas on the table. We just want to make sure that they reflect the principles of the UN Charter and that they reflect the reality that Russia is the aggressor and that Ukraine is defending its territory against this unprovoked aggression. But we are happy to hear, and I think the Ukrainians are happy to sit down with those that want to genuinely try to bring the two sides together. We have been skeptical of the PRC's attempt to do so, in part because for quite some time they were only engaging one side. They were only talking specifically to the Russians, although that has changed recently. Nonetheless, though, the person who ultimately has to make the decision about the conditions under which negotiations will take place is President Zelensky.
All right, a final question here. It's been a year since that strategic concept released last year in Madrid at the last NATO summit, and it was a historic first in terms of fairly straightforward language on China for naming China in the way that it did. Well, it's been a year since that strategic concept, which was fairly clear. Has NATO made significant progress in addressing the challenges that it outlined at the time?
Well, this strategic concept that was released last year, it's really the mission statement for the alliance for those that aren't familiar with it. And this is a document that the alliance rewrites about once every 10 years. So it was a major development to have the alliance turn out a new strategic concept last year that mentioned the PRC for the first time. It talked about the ways in which the PRC is attempting to erode the rules-based order, divide the transatlantic partners, split the unity that exists across many democratic partners and those that are willing to support and defend the principles in the UN Charter. So we are moving out on a variety of tools and initiatives that will shift us from not just assessing the nature of the problem to really addressing it. And we do hope that not only in this summit that will be taking place in a few days, but when we get to the Washington summit next year, we'll have more to say on this particular challenge. But it was historic for the alliance to mention the PRC for the first time.
And a quick amendment on what we said earlier. Ukraine did not apply for membership back in 2008. What did happen at the Bucharest summit in 2008 was the members then pledged that both Ukraine and Georgia would be given eventual membership in NATO, but offered no concrete guarantees, no timeline, and even the so-called membership action plan. That did not happen then. It did not apply for membership. That is still very much up in the air.